It's 2 days after St. Patrick's Day. We're in a central part of the downtown in an area known as the Oregon District. At 6 p.m., the police department gets a call from a woman who is very distressed.
I see Mrs. Ferrara, and she pretty much said she was afraid to go in. I entered the bar. I walked around the corner. All of a sudden, it hit me.
He finds a body in a pool of his own blood.
I waited for a second for my partner to arrive. So we go down the hall a little bit further. And there's another body face down.
The person who did this crime knows these people. He still thinks that somehow he can get away with this. Oh, please. If you think this is going to end well, you're sorely mistaken. When Kane busted a cap and Abel, did he send a uniform to take the report? No, he sent a f***ing detective. I spent my career closing murder cases. But I'm not the only one who answered the call. It takes a rare breed to solve the unsolvable, to catch a ruthless killer, to find justice for the dead. That's what it takes to be an American detective.
I'm Doyle Burke. I'm a retired homicide detective from the Dayton Police Department. In my 22 years in homicide in Dayton, I was directly involved in over 800 homicide investigations. I grew up on the east end of Dayton. I went to Dayton public schools. In high school, we'd all go and watch the football game. And just unexpectedly, someone pulled out a knife and stabbed one of our coaches to death for no reason. I'd never seen anything like that before, and I was kind of intrigued by it. Years later, I knew this police officer, and we got to be friends, and one day he said, "Why don't you come and ride along with me for a night? You might get a kick out of it." And that got me hooked. The next day, I'm like, this is what I'm gonna be. And I became a homicide detective. Homicide is the gold level of police work, bar none. We're the CEO of these investigations, and it's a great responsibility.
Detective Burke is a hard worker. Many times I would laugh because he would seem to be doing 18 things at one time, answering the phone, talking to somebody. He'd always call the victims' families. He knew it was important.
Doyle Burke had the respect of all the police officers, supervisors, everybody. He was very, very good with people, and he was sincere with it.
It's not easy, but if I had been an engineer, I'd have been bored to death. There's no doubt in my mind. This is much better. The day we got the call, we had a Klan rally, which is a rarity in Dayton.
The Ku Klux Klan is a white supremacist organization that came into being in the 19th century. They ruled in their minds the master race. It advanced through the country like a pox. It tends to attract the dim-witted who are easily influenced.
They have a First Amendment right, but they're bringing an awful, ugly message that we don't want associated in any way with our city. It's a city that was, at the time, probably 40% black. Most people were not happy to see them.
And that is potentially violent. So they had hundreds of Dayton police officers to contain what was thought to be, maybe 100,000 people. They left me and my partner as the only two guys not in uniform in case we got a homicide. And they go, well, you've got a homicide. And I said, oh, was it the Klan rally? And they go, oh, no, we've got 2 people that are beaten to death inside Sloopy's bar.
So it still could be the case that this was racially motivated. But he wondered about that. Burke is a smart guy. The real key to any investigation is to keep an open mind.
The Oregon District is the main entertainment district. You had a number of bars, so if you went to one and it was crowded, you could just wander down to the other.
The flagship in that time was Sloopy's. When I got to the scene of Sloopy's, I talked to Officer Keller, and he described to me the bar was not open at the time, that we had 2 victims. The side door where we went in led to the kitchen area.
The first victim, they check his wallet, and detectives identify him as one Robert Napke, 38 years of age. A relatively young man.
Robert Napke was my first concern because he was closest to the door by the walk-in freezer. He was beaten in the back of the head 17, 18 times.
The killer hit him repeatedly with this instrument, whatever it is. A shell fracture of the entire skull. This is a classic case of overkill.
In cases like this, you have what you physically have, and then you have what it means. So yes, we have a dead guy. He's been hit on the back of the head with something, and he fell face first. That's static. But what does it mean? It means the suspect was behind him. It means he probably opened that door for him, and he knew him enough to where he trusted him enough to walk in front of him. I'm convinced to this day, Napke was totally caught off guard. The suspect just beat him to death. The other victim was laid out on top of his coat. And his injuries were identical to Robert Napke's. He's beaten to death in the back of the head. The autopsy later revealed that the second victim had 19 blows to the head, very violent.
Keller then points out something to Burke.
And there was a wallet hidden behind the toilet tank.
The wallet belongs to our second victim, Frank Ferraro, a man 65 years of age and the husband of Mrs. Ferraro, the 911 caller.
His wallet had all his ID and $211 in cash.
Detectives, I believe Frank must have had a hunch, I'm gonna get robbed. So he removed his personal wallet, put it behind the toilet so the robber wouldn't get his wallet.
We went to the office area. And in the office area was a hammer. We could see that it had some blood on it and what appeared to be hair on it. Hopefully we can get some DNA, fingerprints, whatever off of it.
Obviously, this is our weapon. Humans are fragile. They're damaged easily. You've got a hammer in your hand and you are at the edge of rage. You are a killing machine.
You'd be silly to say that things like this don't bother you, but you have to go to kind of the greater good. This is what I do. And yes, this is horrible. How much worse will it be if we don't get who did this?
So Detective Burke speaks to Grace Ferraro, the victim's wife. Grace explains her husband was an Army veteran, 44 years in the Postal Service, decided to want to continue to work. His sons owned Sloopy's. Dad wanted a job. The sons decided to provide him with one. Let him be the day manager. Let him keep the books.
His wife, Grace, loved him with all her heart and just could not understand how her love of her life could be taken away.
Robert Napke was relatively young, in his late 30s. He was known in the Oregon District by everyone. He was the general laborer guy. He was a jack of all trades. No one had anything bad to say about him.
My name is Jim Napke, and I am Robert Napke's brother. Robert was the fifth of 9 children. He was someone who could easily make friends. A lot of people wanted to be around him. Robert was very trustworthy, and he expected you to be trustworthy also. At Sloopy's, he was in charge of janitorial, custodial type work. Robert, as far as I know, didn't have any problems or issues working at Sloopy's. He wanted to keep his life pretty simple. As long as he had his friends, he was happy with that. With Robert's death, it was after midnight, and my sisters called me and told me the news he had been beaten to death. We were all shocked, you know, what happened. You know, nightmare.
It's always difficult to come to grips with what's occurred. Neither of the families had a clue why these 2 men were killed. Knowing that it's Dayton, that there's a Klan rally, it's right after St. Patrick's Day, I knew there was going to be a lot of work to figure out who did this just by virtue of what it was. So my partner and I are on scene at Sloopy's. Got a page from dispatch. I called in. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me, right? Like, okay, we'll take care of it. They go, got another double homicide.
Double homicides are rare. Double homicides within an hour of each other are incredibly rare. So now Burke has another complication. What if they are connected? Do we have somebody roaming around the city killing people? What are the odds of that? I would say they'd be very high. Detective Joel Burke is working a double homicide at Sloopy's bar. And he's just learned of yet another double homicide 15 miles away in a convenience store.
My partner, he's like, this is a joke, right? And I'm like, no, it's not a joke.
What do we do if this is an ongoing event and we're going to keep finding bodies?
With these 2 double homicides occurring like that in the same time frame, until you've got a suspect identified and cuffed, everything's in play. Anything's possible.
When Burke hears about this other double homicide, he's not going to rely on someone else's opinion. He's going to rely on his own. He wants to go to that scene and look for himself. What is the same here?
It was a very small mom-and-pop carryout. Both of the clerks had been shot and killed. Cash drawer was gone. I mean, it was an obvious robbery.
Someone comes unstuck and they open fire. Burke is hopeful there's not another one in the next hour, but we'll see. It puts the pressure up. There are similarities in these 2 cases, but the most important thing is the manner of death. They were both shot to death with a handgun from some distance away. Not the same as beating somebody to death right in front of your face. It's a different kind of crime.
The way things were done up at the carryout led you to believe they weren't connected, and ultimately it was not related.
Later, 3 men were arrested for that double homicide, and all of them were convicted. And there was no question it had nothing to do with Sloopy's bar murders. So now Burke is back to Sloopy's bar, to talk to the night manager, who relieves Ferraro when he leaves during the day.
I said, I need a list of all your current and former employees. He goes, fine. But you know, everybody does everything. What are you talking about? Everybody does everything. He goes, the Oregon District, every bar here works with every bar here.
It's an informal alliance.
If somebody was running out of a certain product or somebody was low on cash for whatever reason, a different bar owner might help them.
Sloopy's is the biggest, and TB Hopkins is the second biggest. So the employees from Hopkins routinely come over to Sloopy's because it's very close.
One of the other things we learned is now the Oregon District is famous for its Halloween party. What I didn't realize is St. Patrick's Day was right behind it. That was the #2 moneymaker.
St. Patrick's Day is a unique American holiday. Everybody gets toilet-hugging, snot-licking drunk, and they'll stay that way for a week, both in advance of, the day of, and a week after. The bars make 6 months of their income in about 2 weeks.
When you were drinking in those bars, you were probably paying with cash because it was a cash business.
The manager was a wealth of information. We had a lot of questions.
One key to any investigation is to establish a time of death. The last person to see him alive, Ferraro, was his wife. She said her husband left that morning at 5 a.m. to go to the bar, clean up. At 6 p.m., he's dead. That's 12 hours later. So to narrow that down to a period of an hour or two is very significant.
Obviously, we couldn't let the manager into the bar. We have to preserve the integrity of the scene. We had taken some photos.
Burke is experienced, and he's smart.
And I show him the bar stools on the tables, the office, and things I thought he could get an idea with what they were doing.
Burke says, how far along were they in the cleanup?
And then he goes, oh, they're nearing the end, so 10, 11 o'clock.
So the killer commits this crime between the hours of 10 and 11 in the morning.
So that all fit, and that was very helpful. And then he's looking at the office, he goes, hey, our safe is missing. He goes, there should be a fire safe that sits right here.
The manager tells Burke, there's a safe here where the night manager, me, puts the receipts in the bank bags. And when Ferraro comes in the morning, he takes the bags to the bank.
Whoever did this thought that the safe would be stuffed with money because of St. Patrick's Day. And it would have been, but Frank had already made a deposit. So now we got a safe that's missing. I'm like, how big is this safe? He goes, it weighs about 150 pounds. I said, so one guy could carry it? He goes, oh, yeah.
So now we're faced with another problem. Is this a crime of opportunity after the murders? Our man is walking out. Well, hey, that's a safe. It's not that big. Or is this purpose of this crime the theft of this vault? Then how do you explain the savagery of the attack? We don't know. We weren't here. That's the disadvantage of being a homicide detective. You're never there when you should be. Burke knows the likelihood of finding this safe is slim to none. But nevertheless, he puts out a bolo on it. He's thorough. You have to be.
You work every case to its most logical conclusion. I was at my desk looking through things, trying to solve this. When I got a phone call from Chris Ingalls, a reporter for one of the local news stations. He says, I've got a letter I think you need to see. It may be related to the Sloopy's homicide. And I said, great, bring it on down.
So he comes down and shows Burke a letter addressed to him at the TV station.
There was a return address from the devil in hell. And it basically was a one-page note about how they had killed the two people at Sloopy's because they were mad because the city let the Klan rally come into town.
Dayton police lie when they say the killings are not related. Maybe not directly, but in rage.
I personally beat the young stupid one by the walk-in freezer, hit him a lot with one of my boys' tool. The old guy in the toilet, he died.
Maybe next time KKK want to come to Dayton, you say no. Maybe families ask, where was my police protection?
I tell them they protect the crackers at Rally. One day we really will overcome.
Street talk, mistakes, misspelled words.
There are pieces in here only the killer would know. The old guy in the toilet, Mr. Farrow died in the men's room. About the young boy by the freezer, that's the prep area.
But one most critical thing, he says a hammer. Why is that so important, you say? Well, because they never told the public what the weapon was. Yet this guy knows it's a hammer.
And we just thought this has got to be from the suspect.
Interesting. Who is our author? There's been an angry letter sent to the press alleging this murder is based on racial hatred.
And they had killed the two people at Sloopy's because they were mad because the city let the Klan rally come into town.
We will leave this courthouse.
We tend to think of the Klan as a Southern phenomenon, but when they were at their height in the 1920s, a lot of the biggest states for the Klan were actually in the Midwest. There was segregation everywhere. In Dayton, we had segregated schools, we had segregated swimming pools, so that existed up here.
They came here to incite to violence. They came here to spew their rhetoric and try to make people mad and try to get those people to do something.
Stop the Klan.
It was that morning of the murders, so that fits. Somebody incensed over the meeting and then goes off and kills people.
We had to at least theorize that maybe this is a retaliation for the Klan. I mean, what a coincidence.
Burke needs to find out what happened at this rally. So he finds the officers that were assigned to the detail.
I knew we had over 200 officers on duty there, and I talked to them. They go, I think we outnumbered the people there. Some people showed up, but boy, not in the numbers that we were expecting. So it was kind of a wash.
So now the only fact we have is that somebody wrote a letter to the press and knew things that had never been released to the public. The letter is undoubtedly from the killer.
Who would send such a letter was the first thing that got into my mind. And then the smarter part of me kicked in and I said, could the guy that did this actually be dumb enough to try to do this to throw us off?
So Burke has decided this racial motivation is just probably not accurate at all. There's no evidence to support it. So now we're back to square one.
It was one of these paperwork days. I was at my desk looking through things. We got a call that a safe had been located behind one of the hardware stores.
Well, would you look at that? The safe was actually found, and someone pried it open.
It was a Sloopy safe. There was no doubt about it.
Now we've got something solid. We have an object that this person who's responsible for the crime touched and had in his possession.
So our evidence technician took it to the crime lab and did an analysis on it.
In this case, the safe, they brought it in. Now, laboratory, what can you tell me about this? What did they use to break into it?
A 150-pound safe is more like having a secure lock on your closet. They don't require sophisticated effort to get into. They don't require somebody who knows how to manipulate a combination lock. All they require is force.
The lab people now take a look at it and they say, oh, I see, here's the Jimmy marks, and we're documenting those things. The safe, it didn't have fingerprints on it, but on the side of it, there's red paint.
It looked like a paint transfer. like the safe impacted against something that was painted red. It's anyone's guess at this point, but right now it's not helpful. What Burke needs is a suspect. Sloopy's Bar is such a landmark in this neighborhood of bars that people are still discussing this case days later. It is the talk of the town and of the press.
We had Crime Stoppers. We, of course, said, you know, with everything on the news, anybody with any information, call in about anything. I thought we would solve this, but you don't know. You just don't know, and it's tough to take. But every time we thought we were at our wits' end, we always had something that would pull us back in the right direction.
Tips start to roll in, and several anonymous informants say that a guy named Edmund Emmerich III should be looked at by the police.
Edmund Emmerich III was a bouncer.
He worked at T.B. Hopkins' bar, which is practically next door to Sloopy's. Of course he knew Frank Ferraro and Robert Napke. He dealt with them all the time.
Now, you're not convicting a guy of ag murder on that, but it makes him somebody you need to talk to.
He had a reputation as being a hothead. If someone mouthed off to him,
he would beat people half to death.
He was fired by the bar because he just was more trouble than he was worth. Now, Burke immediately thinks, hot temper, you say? Well, we are certainly looking for one of those. Burke decides to run Emmerich's name to see if anything comes up.
And lo and behold, Edmund Emmerich III, he was wanted on the traffic warrant.
Now Burke has something to work with. Let's see what you have to say for yourself, Mr. Emmerich. Now Burke is convinced he is on the right track. Now this gentleman, Edmund Emmerich III, has a traffic warrant.
So now we had him dumped in our lap.
Doyle was already legendary when I met him. He had that reputation to work a confession and just gradually trap them with their own words. And he was exceptionally good at that.
My thing is everything's a battle, and I don't want to lose. I mean, I go into the room thinking, if I come out of here with nothing, they won. And I don't want them to win, so I want to get something.
Burke says he's investigating a double murder at Sloopy's and asks Emmerich, do you know Frank Ferraro and Robert Napke? No, I never heard of him.
If you worked down there, you had to know both those guys, especially Napke. He was in every inch of that Oregon district 7 days a week. Everybody knew Robert Napke.
He asks Emmerich where he was on March 19th. Now, this is 9 days after the date the bodies were discovered.
And he laid out everywhere he was, hour by hour by hour. And he started at 10 o'clock, I was at my dad's. Then I went to the Patterson Pony Cake and got a 6-pack of beer. Then I went to the Patterson Park Laundromat and got my clothes. I'm like, you pretty sure about all that? Yeah. In my mind, I'm like, oh, this is good. Nobody can remember this. No one. Why would you?
Emmerich is telling Burke a story as if he's rehearsed the story before. However, being suspicious doesn't give you the right to arrest anybody. He lets him go.
We went to the Pony Keg, and we felt like idiots, but we said, look, I know you probably sell 10 million bottles of beer in a week, but 2 weeks ago, a guy came in, bought a 6-pack of beer in the afternoon, and we showed him a photo spread. And he goes right to Emmerich's photo and says, yeah, that's him. He said, look at me and look at the clock and remember that I was here.
Now, the explanation of him being there is very bizarre, but the fact remains he was there. So that 12 to 2 checks out.
And we went to the laundromat, it was even better. The lady said, I remember him, here's his name, and it was around 2 o'clock.
She said this same fellow makes a huge fuss about the fact he has to have this laundry.
He had 31 pounds of laundry, which is an immense amount of laundry. And she goes, he parked far away, and we're like, why don't you just pull it up again? He goes, no, I'm good.
Now, what is he doing? He's drawing attention to himself by raising a fuss. The clerk tells Burke she thought it was just kind of odd the way he acted. So I kind of looked out the window to see how he was going to get all that clothing into this car. Burke asked her, what kind of car is he in?
She goes, it was a little red Dodge Daytona.
Well, my. Red, like the kind that can produce a paint transfer on a safe. Mr. Emmerich has a great deal of explaining to do. However, Mr. Emmerich, he's been giving alibis all day long, and so far, they've all checked out. The last stop for Burke is Emmerich's father.
2 pounds of heroin was seized along.
Now, they strongly believe these people were killed between the hours of 10 and 11 in the morning. Emmerich said he was with his dad all morning, the most critical part of his alibi, which is the time frame of the murder.
We made it clear to Emmerich's father, you know, we're homicide detectives and we want to talk to you about your son, Eddie. And he was very cordial. I want to know if we want to have some coffee. And we talked for a while. He couldn't remember if he was there or not. And then he asked who we were again, and we told him. And then he asked us if we'd like to have some coffee. And it was clear that he had memory problem, maybe some dementia.
Burke believes Emmerich intentionally used his father as the final nail in his alibis, knowing that his father could not confirm nor deny that he was there.
He couldn't remember who we were, much less, you know, whether or not Emmerich was there on the 19th.
So his plan blows up in his face.
Once we showed the alibi was just crap, even though we now have a tremendous amount of suspicion on Emmerich, you have to have probable cause. So we had Emmerich's car towed to the crime lab.
They look at the car.
Oh my God, there's a whole gray scratch area on his vehicle. That's a clue. So we do an examination of the paint, number of layers and the color, do a side-by-side comparison and a chemical analysis.
Ken called me on over that they had some results.
These marks were made by that corner of that safe as it was rubbed across this vehicle.
So now we had hard physical, forensic, scientific evidence that tied Emmerich to these two murders. There's no way you can explain that safe being in your car. It's irrefutable. In this case, it matched, and Emmerich was our man.
Police work is one foot in front of the other. It's paperwork by the metric ton. And yet, at the end, when you finally assemble this tonnage of information and you're going to go get your man, there's nothing better. Nothing. They go to Emmerich's house.
You always use an abundance of caution when you're going after a murder suspect, especially somebody this cocky and this brutal and violent.
Once you've killed once, after that it's only numbers.
We could see him looking out of the front window. The good thing for us is this wasn't our first rodeo. We had officers in the back, so he's not getting out of the house.
And then you announce, police, open the door. Another knock, another announcement. Open the door, answer is no. Battering ram, goodbye door. Mr. Emmerich, let's see how the rest of your day is going to work out. Please open that house like a tuna can. We're going to scoop up Mr. Emmerich and haul him away.
We look through the house. We go through every room. He is in that house, but we can't find him in that house. And that's eerie because he's a murderer. He could jump out with a knife, you know, who knows? So now we have to fine-tune the search. And as we're combing through the basement, we see a cellar door. And we saw that and we're like, that's got to be it.
And there is Mr. Emmerich, crouched like a little baby with his hands over his head, announcing, "Don't shoot."
There's a great deal of satisfaction when you know you've got the right guy. Well, I would have loved to have another crack at him in an interview room, but I don't think any of us felt that was ever going to happen.
And this man, Mr. Emmerich, he doesn't want to make a statement. Fine. Confessions are very rare, but if you don't have a case, don't arrest him. So, what motivated Emmerich to do this? Is it just his temper? Oh, that certainly helped. But Emmerich was desperate. He'd been fired from the job he had. He had no money.
Emmerich was familiar with the Oregon District and the fact that there would be a lot of money after St. Patrick's Day. He knew Sloopy's was the biggest bar at the time, and they had money, and he was going to take money.
What he doesn't know is that morning, Ferraro took the proceeds from the night before to the bank night depository. Emmerich thought he'd get all this money. Didn't happen.
That morning, he knew there'd be guys in there cleaning up. He knew one of them would probably be Robert because that's what Robert did.
Emmerich goes to the side door entrance. Napke thinks, well, it's Emmerich, assuming he's there for business.
I don't know if he went in there with the idea of, I'm going to have to eliminate any witnesses that I find, but they had no chance.
We speculate.
25 people.
Emmerich grabs a hammer out of a toolbox. And bludgeons Napke to death. And because of his temper, he goes crazy.
The autopsy revealed there's no defensive wounds. Robert never even saw it coming.
We theorized that Mr. Ferraro heard the commotion and thought it was a robbery. Ran into the men's room, stuffed his wallet between the toilet tank and the wall, turned and came out of the stall, and is confronted by Emmerich.
Frank was told to lay down there. Probably said, I'm not laying on that floor.
Ferraro said, let me use my jacket, the floor's filthy, and he let him do that because it took the fear away. But he ain't just gonna lay down, or he's not gonna hurt me. And then he attacks him and kills him.
It was a horrible way to die.
Frank Ferraro had 19 blows to the head, and Robert Napke had 18.
So after he has eliminated these two potential witnesses, he then gets the safe and then takes it out to his car, struggles with it, scrapes some of the paint off the car with the safe, and drives off.
He tried to make it look like it was a racial incident by sending that devil in hell letter. And ultimately, that letter hurt him too.
The FBI has a handwriting analysis unit at Quantico in their laboratory in Virginia. And they determined through samples obtained from him and the original letter he wrote to the press as being written by the same person. That person was Edmund Emmerich III, and no other.
Emmerich was ultimately indicted for an aggravated robbery, 2 counts of aggravated murder. They found him guilty of all the crimes and the specifications. Emmerich was sentenced to the maximum amount of time that he can. He would now be 97 years old the first time he comes up for parole. So I don't think Emmerich's ever getting out, and he shouldn't get out.
My brother was a good, law-abiding citizen who wanted to live a simple life and have a lot of friends. to have at his funeral over 700 people. That's a homage to Robert.
Frank was a stellar person. Everybody loved him. And really, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that's all. I think that was hardest for his family to come to grips with. And I get asked all the time, what's the worst case? What's the most horrible? You know, you can't rank tragedies. I mean, you can't, because everybody is important to somebody. And you got to work every case that way. You have to be dedicated to this. I won't go as far as saying it's a calling, but you certainly have to want to do this.
Two innocent men die violently for a few $100s of change money and destroy two families in the process. Justice? Maybe. Closure? Not possible. But I'll take justice if I can't find anything else. So Doyle Burke. He'll take the justice. Like all American detectives do. On the next American Detective.
Fire is his thing. He was gonna erase his footsteps.
I realized he was a wolf in sheep's clothing.
I was shocked, and I'm like, what are you talking about?
A lot of murderers are emotional when they take a life. Not him, because he's cold as ice.
Human beings are strange creatures. They kill for the most foolish reasons you can possibly imagine. They kill for money that will vanish like smoke. And they kill because their own minds spin a web of madness, so thick that truth cannot pierce it. I have spent a lifetime staring into the abyss of human nature, and let me tell you, it never ceases to amaze me how quickly a life can be snuffed out over absolutely nothing. Take Shirley Pierce. She was a 62-year-old Southern lady living in Rowan County, North Carolina, in a quiet, family-based community in Kannapolis. People who knew her said she was a ray of sunshine, so pleasant, so outgoing, and just beautiful. She was a mother, a grandmother to a little boy who was the apple of her eye, and after some hard years working in the accounting department at the Tuscarora Yarn Factory, she had finally found the true love of her life in a textile salesman named Chuck Reeves. They had been engaged for just a few months. They planned to live a good life together. But destiny has a cruel sense of humor, and those wedding bells would never ring. On July 23, 2013, at 9:40 in the morning, Chuck Reeves dialed 911. He went to Shirley's nice, quiet home and walked into an eerie feeling. He found blood on the floor, what he thought was powder, and then he found his fiancée in the bathtub with the water running over her motionless body. There was blood everywhere. When my fellow detectives arrived at that house, the smell of violent death was masked by something else, the sharp, stinging odor of bleach. The killer had tried to clean the scene, leaving bleaching patterns on the carpet, leading from the bedroom into the bathroom, and inside that tub lay Shirley. She had been attacked with sharp object, suffering multiple stab wounds to her face and her neck. It was a ferocious scene. Blood had even dripped from the ceiling fan. My. This wasn't a random burglary. No forced entry. No drawers turned upside down. This was overkill, an explosion of pure, unadulterated rage. In our business, you always look at the person who found the body first. Chuck Reeves was devastated, but he was cooperative. He told us he spoke to Shirley the night before at around 8:15 p.m. She was supposed to dog sit for him, but mid-conversation, the line went dead. Drop calls were common there, so he didn't panic until he arrived the next morning, found the garage open but the door locked, used a spare key, and found the horror in the bathroom. We checked his hands. Not a scratch. You attack someone that viciously with a knife, your hands are going to get cut. Chuck's hands were clean, and his employer confirmed he was working out of town in South Carolina when the murder happened. So, Chuck is cleared. Then Shirley's daughter, Tracy, points us toward a ghost from the past, an old boyfriend named Richard. 10 years prior, Richard was abusive, threatened Shirley with a screwdriver, and she had to get a restraining order. We found Richard at a local pawn shop 15 minutes away. He was shocked. His hands were clean, and frankly, the man was in terrible physical shape, barely able to walk. He wasn't our killer. Then the telephone rings and the case takes a sharp, bizarre turn. It's a shocker when you hear a spouse call in and say, "I think my spouse may have killed somebody." The caller was Irvin Johnson, the chief financial officer at Tuscarora Yarns where Shirley worked. He was highly agitated. He told us he was certain his 61-year-old wife, Marlene Johnson, had butchered Shirley. Why? Because Marlene had spent years consumed by a dark, toxic obsession. Marlene came from wealth, grew up in Gastonia, and was a woman dressed to the nines, slender, elegant, and unused to being told no. But in 2003, Marlene suffered a severe nervous breakdown after a suicide attempt and never recovered. Her mind warped into a prison of extreme jealousy and paranoia. When Oyvind took the CFO job in 2006 and introduced Marlene to Shirley, Shirley casually called him honey and touched his arm. That was it. Marlene's antenna went up. Marlene became entirely convinced that her husband was having an affair with Shirley. There was absolutely no evidence of infidelity, but fact and reality mean nothing to a broken mind. Marlene hired private investigators, used drones to get aerial views of Shirley's house, tracked her grocery trips, and learned the schedule of her garage door. In 2011, Marlene's madness boiled over at a local restaurant. She showed up in black workout clothes, hiding her face behind a menu. When Shirley tried to leave with co-workers, Marlene moved like a gazelle, jumped on Shirley's back, grabbed her hair, slammed her around, and screamed, "I will kill you for fucking my husband." Shirley didn't press charges to save Irvin embarrassment, hoping a restraining order would suffice. Irvin eventually moved out, fearing for his own life, convinced Marlene would kill him next. We obtained a search warrant for Marlene's home and found her car parked at her attorney's office. In the trunk, there were cleaning supplies. Inside her house, we found Google Maps aerial photos of Shirley's residence and hours of surveillance notes, a picture of pure obsession. When Marlene sat in that interview room, she wore sunglasses, looking bored and completely uninvolved. You have to be kidding me. But her hands told the real story. She had a French manicure, and the tips of her nails were broken off, her fingers marred by fresh cuts. She had used those hands in a savage fight. The next day, the medical examiner found a critical piece of evidence during the autopsy. A broken knife blade lodged deep inside Shirley's neck. To snap a stainless steel kitchen knife inside a victim requires immense, terrifying physical force. Shirley had suffered excruciating pain for several minutes before she died. We didn't find the matching handle at Marlene's house, so we turned our attention to a man named Tim Connor, a motivational speaker and author who was Marlene's close friend. When we first talked to him, he was cool, providing Marlene with a solid alibi, claiming she stayed at his house the entire night of July 22. But my detectives knew he was lying. On July 25, we searched Tim's house and found a knife block. It was a set of 4, but one was missing. The blade in Shirley's neck matched Tim's set perfectly. Faced with the missing knife, Tim's cool exterior shattered into a groveling mess. He admitted he hadn't been honest. Marlene had not stayed the night. She had met him for breakfast the next morning and begged him to lie for her, to be her alibi. Her story evaporated into thin air. Later, the state crime lab found Marlene's DNA on the shower curtain where Shirley's body was placed. There was no other DNA. Let's look inside the mind of Marlene Johnson. Her ego was an insatiable monster. Her inner monologue wasn't driven by reality, but by a desperate need to control and possess. Seeing her husband respect another woman, a competent, beautiful colleague, fractured Marlene's fragile sense of superiority. To Marlene, Shirley wasn't a human being. She was an obstacle that needed to be erased. On that fateful night, Marlene slunk through the darkness, waited for Shirley to pull into her garage, and slipped inside behind her. Shirley was winding down, talking to her fiancé, completely unaware that malice incarnate was standing in her home. The attack was sudden and relentless. Shirley fought for her life, cutting Marlene's hands in the struggle, but the fury of the obsession carried the blade. Once the deed was done, Marlene dragged Shirley into the tub, turned the water on, and frantically poured bleach over her own blood trails, thinking she could wash away her sins. In January of 2018, Marlene Johnson stood trial for first-degree murder. She sat there looking demure, highly professional, acting as though she were completely untouchable. But when the clerk read the verdict of guilty, her facade shattered. Marlene let out an audible gasp and collapsed onto the courtroom floor. She was sentenced to life without parole. She will spend the rest of her days behind bars, living off tax money, while Shirley Pierce lies in a grave because of a phantom affair that existed only in the twisted mind of a coward. Now, if you think that is the only way a mind can break, let me take you down to St. Petersburg, Florida. It is a beautiful city on the water, a sleepy town for retirees that has exploded with growth. On Yellow Pine Drive, inside a mobile home community, stood a trailer that had fallen into foreclosure. On May 9, 2005, an independent contractor named Jason McCain and his son arrived to clean it out. The neighbor told him nobody had lived there for 8 or 9 months. Inside, the cleaners found a home frozen in time. A half-undecorated Christmas tree stood in the hall. Calendars and personal items were strewn about as if someone had just dropped everything and fled. But there was something else. The house was littered with stand-up dial air fresheners, boxes of baking soda, and little cardboard car fresheners hanging in closets and counters. The odor was foul, and as they approached the final bedroom where the door was shut, the stench became overwhelming. On the bed lay a mattress with several heavy blankets piled on top. When the cleaners tried to lift the blankets, they couldn't. The fabric had stuck to the mattress like Velcro coming apart. They dragged the heavy mass to the floor, and the plastic wrapping tore open, revealing a human leg and 5 toes. When the police arrived, the body was so severely mummified and decomposed that you couldn't tell the sex or the race. It had been rotting under those sheets for months. Records showed the home belonged to 2 sisters, Barbara Burns and Deborah Burns. Both were missing, along with Barbara's van. To understand how a body ends up rotting in a foreclosed trailer, you have to look back 40 years into the lives of these 2 women. Barbara Burns was born in 1951, the eldest daughter in a blue-collar family. In 1964, her youngest sister, Debbie, was born. At 2 years old, Debbie contracted scarlet fever, leaving her with severe brain damage and neurological defects. She had the mental capacity of a 6-year-old child, a twisted spine from scoliosis, a distinct limp, and only 3 teeth. Shortly after their father died, the mother went to work, and 15-year-old Barbara was pulled out of high school to become Debbie's permanent nursemaid. In that exact moment, Barbara's independent life ceased to exist. For decades, Barbara was the sole caretaker and eventual breadwinner, working minimum wage jobs at restaurants and a Beal's outlet department store, going home every single day to care for her mother and her disabled sister. Her personal life was absolutely non-existent. In 2000, her mother passed away from Alzheimer's. Shortly after, their brother John died, leaving a $350,000 inheritance specifically to take care of Debbie. For the first time in her life, 50-year-old Barbara thought they were rich. She quit her job. They bought the $80,000 mobile home and took lavish trips to California and Australia. But Debbie had no impulse control. Her mind remained that of a spoiled child, and with a credit card and online shopping, she turned their home into a warehouse of Star Wars memorabilia, toys, and trinkets. Debbie also fell prey to an online romance scam, mailing expensive gifts to a man in Miami who vanished the moment the cash cow dried up. Within 3 short years, they blew through every single penny of the $350,000. By 2004, the inheritance was gone. The home entered foreclosure. Barbara had to swallow her pride and go back to working minimum wage at 7-Eleven, while Debbie's attitude turned toxic. Debbie was demanding, rude, and physically abusive. At a company Christmas party, when Barbara wanted to stay a little longer, Debbie threw a tantrum grabbed Barbara's beer, and thumped it over, forcing Barbara to leave. Despite Debbie being dead in that trailer, someone was still withdrawing her $651 monthly Social Security disability check from an ATM in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Surveillance footage showed the person cashing those checks was none other than Barbara Burns. My partner and I flew up to Virginia Beach, waited outside the 7-Eleven until her shift ended at 7 in the morning, and approached her. She was calm and accompanied us to the police station without a fight. Inside the interview room, Barbara tried to play a dangerous game. She claimed she never owned a home on Yellow Pine Street. She claimed she didn't know anyone named Deborah Burns. She claimed she had no siblings at all. I tell you, watching a sweet, elderly lady look you in the eye and deny her own flesh and blood is a chilling thing. But when we showed her the photograph of her sister, the wall of deception collapsed and the tears started flowing. Let's look at the psychological breaking point of Barbara Burns. For 40 years, she was a prisoner to her sister's disability. They shared the same bedroom, their heads nearly touching at night, listening to each other breathe. There was no escape, no privacy, no life of her own. When the money ran out, the reality of poverty crushed Barbara, while Debbie simply demanded more, completely incapable of understanding that the well had run dry. On August 14, which was Debbie's 40th birthday, they went to a restaurant and argued bitterly about finances. Back home, it escalated into a vicious fistfight. Debbie finally went to bed, but Barbara sat in the living room, her mind fracturing under the weight of an endless, suffocating cycle. She looked at the future and saw nothing but decades of abuse, poverty, and thankless servitude. She decided she was not going to go through it again. Barbara walked to the dresser, picked up that .38 caliber revolver she had bought for protection, walked to the bed where her sister was snoring, placed the barrel against Debbie's forehead, and pulled the trigger once. After the fatal shot, Barbara didn't flee immediately. Panic and denial took the wheel. She wrapped her sister's body in towels, sheets, and plastic bags. For 6 agonizing weeks, Barbara continued to live in that trailer alongside her sister's decomposing corpse, placing air fresheners and baking soda in every corner to fight the inescapable stench of death, trying to pretend everything was normal. In October, she finally abandoned the trailer, left her van at a Greyhound station, and took a bus to Virginia Beach, fleeing to the only place where she had happy childhood memories. She confessed to everything on tape. She told us exactly where she had the gun and the remaining bullets in the dresser, and our evidence techs found them precisely where she said they would be. Facing the death penalty, the state attorney's office offered a plea agreement. We recognized that Barbara Burns was not a danger to the public. She was a good person who had endured 40 years of unyielding pressure until her mind simply snapped. She pled guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 15 years. In prison, Barbara actually thrived. For the first time in 40 years, someone else cooked her meals, and she was entirely free from the crushing responsibility that had stolen her youth. She served 12 years with good behavior and was released in 2018, moving back to St. Petersburg. 2 women, 2 vastly different murders. Marlene Johnson killed out an arrogant, poisonous obsession born of an inflated ego. Barbara Burns killed because she was pushed into a dark, inescapable corner by the tragic circumstances of life until she could no longer breathe. Sometimes the world creates a devil, and sometimes it simply creates a breaking point. It is a crazy world, my friends. Keep your eyes open. We are in LaGrange, Georgia. The date is February 4th, 1991. It is a picturesque small town, far removed from the frantic pace of Atlanta. People know their neighbors here. They trust each other, or at least they think they do. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, an emergency call comes into the dispatcher. The caller is a woman named Priscilla Matula. She is 41 years old. She tells the operator that her mother's home has been burglarized and that her mother is badly hurt. The mother is Margaret Abernathy, 66 years old. She is a pillar of this community, one of its wealthiest and most respected residents. She ran a hometown empire that included a local car dealership, real estate, and rental properties. She was a beloved matriarch, a woman who would do absolutely anything for her 3 children. Money was never an issue for Margaret when it came to her family. If they needed help, she gave it. She was their safety net. When the first responders arrive at the scene, they find Margaret lying on the bathroom floor. There is a substantial amount of blood. She is alive, but unconscious, making a heavy, agonal snoring sound. Priscilla rides in the ambulance, watching her mother cling desperately to life. At the hospital, the emergency room physicians discover the horrifying truth. This was no slip and fall, and it was no simple assault. Margaret Abernathy had been shot twice in the back of the head. One bullet was lodged just beneath the skin, but the other had penetrated her brain stem. She is placed on temporary life support, but the damage is done. The family has to make the agonizing decision to unhook the machines and let her pass away. I tell you, a homicide investigation in a town like this changes everything. The house becomes an active crime scene, and the pressure starts to mount immediately. When you have a victim of this status, you automatically look at the financial angle. Wealth makes you a target. Initially, the responding officers look for signs of the home invasion reported by the daughter. The front door is locked. At the back door, there is a broken glass pane. It looks like forced entry. But when seasoned investigators look closely, the pieces do not fit the puzzle. The vast majority of the broken glass is sitting on the outside of the door, not the inside. That means the window was smashed from within the house. Furthermore, the hole in the glass is tiny. You could not even fit a hand through it to unlock the deadbolt. It is a ruse, a bad one. Inside the bedroom, the covers on the bed are turned down, and there is blood on the pillow. This tells us Margaret was likely asleep or lounging when the initial attack occurred. But the human body is resilient. After the first shot, she was somehow able to get out of bed and walk into the bathroom. Investigators find bloody toilet tissue there. This poor woman was standing in front of her mirror, trying to clean herself up, trying to stop the bleeding. That little detail is critical. It proves there was a significant gap of time between the first shot and the second shot. The second bullet hit the brain stem, causing instant paralysis and ending her ability to move or speak. Whoever did this shot her once in the bedroom, waited, and then shot her again in the bathroom to finish the job. The drawers in the bedroom are open, with items neatly placed on the floor. Now, I have seen 1,000 burglaries in my time. True burglars do not tidy up after themselves. They rip drawers out, throw contents everywhere, and smash things looking for quick cash. They do not neatly stack items. More importantly, expensive electronics, televisions, and cameras are left completely untouched in plain sight. The family notes that a few specific items are missing: a mink coat, some expensive jewelry, and a small caliber Derringer pistol. A small caliber weapon, you say. How convenient. At this point, the investigators know exactly what they're looking at. The crime scene has been staged. And when a scene is staged, it is almost always done by someone in the inner circle, someone who had easy access and wanted to throw the police off the scent. You have to be kidding me. The initial focus shifts to the people close to her. Margaret did not live alone. After her husband, Bill, fell ill and subsequently passed away from complications of diabetes, a young man named Diaka Andromulus continued to reside in the spare bedroom. He was a gentle giant, a family friend who helped care for Bill and stayed on to assist Margaret. He had total access to the house. When detectives try to locate him at Johnson Motors, the dealership where he works, his supervisor says he took lunch at 11:30 and disappeared. He is nowhere to be found. But a few hours later, Diaka returns to work. When detectives interview him and break the news of Margaret's death, he breaks down completely. He is inconsolable. He loved her like a grandmother. He explains his sudden disappearance with a simple truth. He had a secret job interview at a rival dealership and did not want his current boss to find out. Detectives verify the story with the other business. His alibi holds up, He is removed from the suspect list. Then comes Nick Matula, Priscilla's husband. He pulls an investigator aside and points a finger directly at Margaret's son, Alec Abernathy. Nick claims Alec was deep in debt, facing severe financial problems, and had openly mused about waiting for his parents to die so he could collect his share of the inheritance. Alec was indeed the beneficiary of a $40,000 double indemnity life insurance policy. It is a solid motive, but when detectives check his whereabouts, an employee named Linda Frazier confirms Alec never left the family dealership that morning until he was summoned to his mother's house after the discovery. Another alibi holds. 2 days pass, and the investigation hits a wall. But in a small town, secrets have a way of bubbling to the surface. On February 6th, an anonymous call comes in from an employee at the Bank of Troup County. The caller states that on the preceding Saturday, just 2 days before her murder, an incredibly distraught Margaret Abernathy came into the branch. She was physically agitated. Her blood pressure was skyrocketing, and she was absolutely adamant about removing her daughter, Priscilla Matula, from every single one of her business accounts. She wanted to strip her of all authority to write checks or make decisions. The bank did not have the necessary personnel to process the changes on a Saturday, so they told her she had to return on Monday morning to finalize it. Margaret agreed, promising she would be back first thing Monday. She never made it. Suddenly, the spotlight turns directly onto the grieving daughter. Detectives bring in a financial expert from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to audit the business records. What they find is an absolute mess. Margaret had been incredibly generous, putting up her own home and a $130,000 certificate of deposit as collateral to help Priscilla and Nick buy their own dealership. But Priscilla was a terrible businesswoman. The business was drowning in the red. To keep the illusion of a positive cash flow, Priscilla had engaged in a massive check-kiting scheme to the tune of $20,000 to $30,000. She was writing bad checks back and forth between different banks, taking advantage of the 5 days it took for checks to clear in those days. She was robbing Peter to pay Paul. She was even logging vehicles as sold when they were still sitting on the lot, fabricating profits out of thin air. Margaret had clearly discovered the deceit. She confronted her daughter and told her the free ride was over. The financial lifeline was being severed on Monday morning. If Priscilla was removed from those accounts, her dealership would collapse. Her husband would be ruined, and she would be left completely destitute. The creature inside Priscilla came out. She was desperate, and desperate people do monstrous things. She knew she had a ticking clock. She had to stop her mother before the bank opened on Monday. Investigators go back to Priscilla's original statement. She had provided an incredibly detailed timeline of her morning. She claimed she left for work around 7:20, got stuck behind school buses, went to the post office, saw a long line, drove around the block 3 times, and went back to work. When a suspect gives you that much unsolicited detail, it is because they are trying to construct a narrative. They are trying to force you to believe an alibi. The narrative crumbles fast. Detectives canvass the neighborhood. A convenience store clerk places Priscilla down the street from her mother's house shortly after 7 in the morning. She lied about her location. Then, a woman viewing a rental property directly across the street from Margaret's home spots Priscilla's vehicle, a Jeep Premier, parked in the driveway between 10 and 10:30 that morning. While inside the rental home, the witness hears what sounds like a gunshot echoing from across the street. In rural Georgia, gunfire is not unusual, so she thought nothing of it at the time. Linda Frazier, the office manager at the dealership, reveals that Priscilla returned to work after 10:30 and suddenly became hyper-focused on her mother. She kept asking if Margaret had called. She tried calling Margaret repeatedly, putting on a show of intense worry for the benefit of the office staff. At lunchtime, Priscilla announced she was going to check on her. Linda, sensing something was wrong, offered to go with her. Priscilla flatly refused, insisting she go alone. Minutes later, the 911 call is placed. On February 12, 1991, Priscilla Matula is placed under arrest. During her interrogation, she is completely stone cold. When asked about the murder of her own mother, she simply refuses to acknowledge the questions. She shuts down. When asked about the fraudulent finances, she arrogantly claims she had the authority to handle the accounts however she saw fit. The state's case is almost entirely circumstantial. There is no eyewitness to the shooting, and the murder weapon, the small Derringer, is missing, likely tossed into a swamp or buried where it will never be found. It is a substantial hurdle for any prosecution. While out on bond in February of 1992, Priscilla makes a fatal mistake. She calls a convenience store clerk, Paige Hester, who had placed her near the scene. Investigators, tipped off ahead of time, tap the phone line. They listen as Priscilla aggressively tries to alter the clerk's memory, pushing her to say it was a different day, trying to manufacture a helpful piece of testimony. It is not explicit bribery, but it shows a guilty mind trying to manipulate the facts. The trial begins in August of 1992. The prosecution lays out the timeline for the jury. On Monday morning, Priscilla sneaks into her mother's home. She finds Margaret asleep and fires a single small-caliber bullet into her head. Believing her mother is dead, she steals the mink coat and jewelry, smashes the window pane from the inside to stage a burglary, and goes to work to establish her alibi. But the mother did not die. She woke up, staggered to the bathroom, and tried to tend to her wounds. Priscilla returns at lunch, discovers her mother is still breathing, and realizes her plan has failed. Instead of calling for medical help, instead of saving the woman who raised her, she stands over her on the bathroom floor and pulls the trigger a second time, delivering the fatal shot to the brain stem. Then she dials 911 and plays the role of the devastated daughter. It is difficult for a jury to accept that a child could possess that level of cold-blooded depravity. Who kills their own mother for a checkbook? But the logic of the financial ruin is undeniable. On August 28, 1992, the jury finds Priscilla Matula guilty of murder. She is sentenced to life in prison. Justice was served, but there are no winners in a case like this. The remaining family members are left utterly shattered. The Sunday dinners, the family vacations, the shared joy of a tight-knit clan, all died on that bathroom floor along with Margaret. A daughter's staggering greed wiped out a legacy of generational kindness, leaving nothing behind but an empty house and profound, lingering ache in a small Georgia town. Human beings are strange creatures. They kill for the most ridiculous reasons you could ever imagine. After 4 decades of staring into the darkest corners of humanity, I thought I had seen it all. But then, reality hits you with a curveball you never saw coming. Tucked away behind the pine-covered hills of the Prescott National Forest in Arizona, there were secrets buried deep that nobody wanted to uncover. People went out there to ride dirt bikes, to shoot targets in the daylight. But when the sun went down, the darkness took hold, and the rotten human soul began to fester. On the evening of September 29, 1988, a target shooter was wrapping up his day. As he headed back to his truck, he stumbled upon one of the many fire pits in an area locals call Gordo's Pit. There was a pile of garbage bags, and a portion of it had been burned. He saw what he thought was a stick poking up from the charred debris. As the gentleman moved closer, he made a horrific discovery. He realized it was not a stick. It was a human arm. He had to rush to a drugstore to call 911. The Yavapai County Sheriff's Office responded within minutes. You could tell that someone had dumped items on top of the victim and set them on fire. It was incredibly brutal and demeaning. The perpetrator wanted to erase every trace, turning a human life into a pile of unrecognizable ash. Back then, investigators searched for clues but had little success. We did not have the sophisticated DNA tools in the late 80s that we have now to tell us something in a lab within minutes. It was hard to discern whether this was a murder site or just a dump site. The autopsy only documented homicidal violence. But the medical examiner could not determine the exact cause of death because the body was too badly damaged. He did note heat kill fly larvae, which meant that from the moment the victim died until the killer decided to light that pyre, a significant amount of time had passed. This suggested she had been killed somewhere else and brought there later. Through dental records, the authorities finally identified this poor soul. It was Pamela Pitts. She had been missing since the night of September 16th, 1988. 13 days. 13 days of her family hanging on to hope, only to be met with a tragedy that would choke the breath out of you. When the police arrived at the home of her father, Paul, that evening to deliver the news, his world shattered. Pam was a wonderful kid, a vibrant teen with a bright smile and a zest for life. She was the oldest of four, a mentor, a sidekick, a guide for her siblings. At 19, she was ready to leave the nest, moving in with a new friend named Shelley Norgard during the summer of 1988. Shelley was an awkward 18-year-old with a mysterious past, seemingly haunted by abandonment issues following her parents' divorce. Her father was a strict, stern taskmaster, and Shelley made it clear she would do anything to avoid moving back in with him if Pam ever decided to leave. To make ends meet, Pam got a job at a local restaurant, dreaming of beauty college. She was artistic. By August of 1988, she had reconnected with an old flame, Bobby Kitchener. Her life was heading toward a bright future when she vanished without a trace on September 16th. Shelley called Bobby, claiming Pam had taken off and not come home. At first, Paul wasn't concerned, but when she failed to show up for work on Monday, he knew something was wrong and called the police. When the horrific truth surfaced about Pam's body being burned, the only question was, who could do this? You always start with the inner circle. Paul later discovered a troubling detail. Pam's car was at home the entire time. Her purse and personal belongings were still there. Yet, Shelley never pointed that out to him. You have to be kidding me. If someone you live with disappears and leaves all their belongings behind, you do not just skip over that detail unless you are hiding something. It turned out their friendship had been souring over money. Rent wasn't being paid. And Pam had told her father she was ready to move out because she didn't trust Shelley, who was known around town for spinning tales and lying. When detectives sat down with Shelley on October 5th, she spun a long, rehearsed alibi. She claimed after work she went to get her boyfriend, Ray Clerks, met friends at Jack in the Box, went to watch a movie, and drove around until the early morning hours. When they questioned Bobby Kitchener, his alibi was solid. He had been at work after seeing Pam at the courthouse square. Then they brought in Ray Clerks. He claimed he didn't know what Shelley did after 11:30 because that is when she went home. When detectives pushed back, saying Shelley claimed she got home at 2:30, Ray stumbled, blamed the passage of time, and shut down, saying he was done talking to the police. The suspicion grew when Shelley's friends revealed something chilling. On the night Pam vanished, Shelley was angry, hunting for her, claiming Pam was responsible for everything wrong in her life. Worse, Shelley had been known to brag in the past about how to get rid of a body, making someone a missing person, then either burning them or dropping them in a mine shaft. I tell you, killers often love to boast about their work before they even commit it. Shelley's psyche reflected a profound hatred, a fragile ego that wanted to destroy anyone she deemed the source of her pain. Police searched the apartment but found no physical evidence, no DNA, no struggle. As the investigation stalled, wild rumors about satanic cults began to spread, fueled by the fact that police had broken up a party at Gordo's Pit the night Pam went missing. But those rumors were just that, rumors, and they eventually fell apart. By the summer of 1989, a lead emerged involving a fight between a girl named Melinda Perry and Pam. The theory was that Melinda, fueled by rage, had finished Pam off at the fire pit. Melinda was brought in, denied the fight, and provided an alibi at a motel. Under pressure from a grand jury, she gave inconsistent statements and was charged with perjury. After 2 years of legal battles, the charges were dropped because her whereabouts that weekend were verified. She left for Nevada and the case went cold. 3 years, then more, the file gathered dust. Then, on May 25, 1991, a shocking discovery dragged the case back into the light. Students exploring a cave found a vertical mine shaft. Hanging there on some lumber was a body wrapped in a waterbed liner. An autopsy revealed he'd been shot in the head and had been decomposing for weeks. Dental records identified him as Ray Clerks, Shelley Norgard's boyfriend. He had been reported missing 3 days prior when he failed to show up for a wedding in California. Ray was a responsible young man, training to be a pilot. Detectives realized the pattern immediately. This was the second roommate of Shelley's to go missing and turn up dead. Look at the psychology of it. 2 individuals, Pam Pitts and Ray Clerks. Both decided they were leaving Shelley Norgard, physically and emotionally, and she could not handle that. The abandonment issues of her past transformed into the murderous rage of her present. This time, Shelley couldn't run. Investigators found her fingerprint on a flashlight at the mine shaft. When they inspected her car, the smell of death was unmistakable. The trunk contained evidence of blood that matched Ray's type. Shelley was arrested on June 4, 1991. By 1993, she took a plea deal, reducing the charge from first-degree to second-degree murder. She confessed that they were stargazing on the hood of the car, and when Ray told her he was leaving and taking their dogs, she lost her mind. She shot him, panicked, covered him with a blanket, and later dumped him in the mine shaft. She was sentenced to 20 years in the Arizona State Prison. Pam's family hoped this would lead to a breakthrough in Pam's case, perhaps thinking Ray had known too much and had to be silenced. But for 18 long years, the case remained frozen. For Paul, it wasn't about hate anymore. It was about justice for his daughter. In March of 2011, a cold case team reopened the file to avoid tainting the process. The new detective was kept in the dark about the Ray Clerks murder initially, but once he saw the files, he realized Shelley was a serial offender with the motive and the capability to kill Pam. In February of 2011, before Shelley's scheduled release, investigators visited her in prison, not to interrogate her, but to remind her they were still looking. Their goal was to trigger recorded phone calls. Shelley was released in May of 2011, assumed a new name, Shelley Norgard Harmon, and started a new life. For 6 years, the case stalled due to personnel changes. Finally, in the spring of 2017, an investigator listened to all 97 of her recorded calls, and he found gold. In one call to her father after the detective's visit, Shelley mentioned they were looking into the Pam Pitts case again. Her father asked, "Are we okay?" and talked about hiring an attorney. Then he said, "Well, that's what I've been thinking for 20 years, but you've never told me what actually happened." The line went dead silent. That silence was the most damning admission of all. That evidence was enough to secure an indictment. On June 2nd, 2017, they arrested Shelley Harmon. When faced with the investigator, she wore a look of defiant resignation. But seeking justice after 30 years is a long shot. Most witnesses were dead or suffering from dementia. The odds were 50-50. Prosecutors had to offer a deal. Shelley would only plead guilty if she served no more time. Knowing she would never fully confess, Paul agreed just to get a conviction. On March 1st, 2021, Shelley stood before the court. She claimed she had gone to find Pam at the party. They argued, and she hit her, couldn't stop hitting her, and Pam stopped breathing. She claimed she fled when she heard voices. She never admitted to burning the body, but Paul knew better. You cannot tell me this was an accident. Burning a person is a deeply personal act of hate. At age 50, Shelley Harmon walked out of the courtroom, credited for her time served in the Ray Clerks murder and her pretrial detention for Pam's case. It is hard to swallow watching a killer of 2 people walk free. It wasn't the maximum sentence I would have liked to see, but in this business, sometimes you have to cherish the small victories. Pam and Ray's memories live on. We finally gave the families the closure they deserved. Justice may be slow, and it may be imperfect, But uncovering the truth is the final chapter of a tragic story that finally brings an end to the nightmare. Human beings are strange creatures, and after years of looking at what they do to one another, I can tell you that they will kill for the most ridiculous reasons you could ever imagine. Because malice does not require intelligence. It only requires an appetite. Now, you take a look at a map of North Carolina, and you will find a place called High Point, a small, quiet community back in April of the year 1990 and so on, where people still left their front doors and their sedans unlocked in the driveway because they believed they were safe. But safety is just an illusion we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night. And that illusion shattered right around 8 o'clock in the morning on a rural stretch of Highway 68. Some highway workers found a station wagon and a body lying face down in a grassy ditch. And when the Guilford County Sheriff's Major Tom Shepard arrived, he realized the 45-year-old victim was a man he had known almost his entire life, a fellow named Fred Brown, who was a truly nice guy, an Army veteran who had served his country bravely during the tumultuous Vietnam War, a college graduate from Fort Sill, Oklahoma, who had become an economics professor at the local community college, where everyone loved him. But out there in that ditch, Fred Brown had 2 bullets in his head and 1 in his back, and his wallet was entirely gone. My. Now, on the surface, a missing wallet makes a uniformed officer think of a random robbery. But seasoned detectives do not look at the surface. They look at the logic. And there was a footprint squarely on the back of Fred's shirt, meaning somebody stood directly over this man and executed him while he was already down on the ground, which is not how a nervous street thief behaves, because a robber wants distance and a quick escape, while this was precise, calculated, and deeply personal. I tell you, a crime like this suggests a trap. So you begin where every homicide investigation must begin, which is with the immediate family. And that brings us to Fred's wife, a 43-year-old woman named Patricia Brown, who had just filed a missing persons report at 10 that morning, when investigators broke the news to Patricia and her teenage daughter Sabra. They noticed something that immediately raised a red flag. Because when you tell a woman that her husband of 20 years has been slaughtered on the side of the highway, you expect a visceral, devastating reaction. But Patricia displayed a cold lack of emotion that just did not fit the frame. She claimed everything was perfect in their marriage, that they had no financial troubles, and that Fred had simply not returned from a late-night trip to the grocery store the evening before, while she was away teaching a real estate class at Randolph Community College, and her daughter was out with friends. The family had solid alibis, including their oldest son, Derek, who was away at school. But when you look deeper into the psychological reality of that household, the picture of a perfect marriage completely disintegrates. You see, Patricia had grown up poor in Oklahoma with a single mother and her younger sister, Sheila, and she always viewed Fred as her white knight, the steady, reliable soldier who would rescue her from poverty. But after Fred retired from the military in 1988 and they settled in North Carolina, Patricia's health began to fail, leading to major open-heart surgery in the year 1990. That medical crisis did something profound to her mind, leaving her feeling broken, vulnerable, and terrified of losing her grip on the comfortable life she had fought so hard to achieve. So she sought comfort in an unconventional obsession, filling her upscale home with 50 or 60 exotic birds that squawked constantly and drove her husband absolutely crazy. Fred wanted to appease his recovering wife, so he funded expensive home renovations, a special bird room, a hot tub, and a privacy fence. But they were living far beyond their means, and their life savings were flying right out the window. The internal tension in that house became a toxic environment. So much so that their former housekeeper quit, because she could no longer stand the way Patricia would screamingly curse and berate Fred, while Fred, a deeply religious man who refused to consider divorce, would never argue back, choosing instead to suffer in silence. The psychological weight of this financial ruin and marital rot turned Patricia from a desperate woman into a cold mastermind, because she looked at her husband and no longer saw a white knight. She saw an obstacle to the lifestyle she envisioned, a piece of property worth more dead than alive. In fact, the financial anxiety was so severe that Fred had walked into the office of his colleague Kenda Vaughn months before his death, looked him dead in the eye, and said point blank that he would not be surprised if Patricia took a contract out on him, because his family would be better off with him dead. You have to be kidding me. A man predicts his own execution because he understands the dark, volatile nature of the woman sharing his bed. Yet the investigation went completely cold for about 6 months because there was no physical evidence connecting Patricia to the trigger, allowing her to collect the state insurance money, sell off family land, and move back to Alabama with a couple $100,000 to open a pet business called Sassy's Pets, where she could live out her twisted dreams surrounded by her precious birds. But justice has a way of being patient, and 3 years later, on July 13, 1994, a call came from the police department in Reading, Pennsylvania, because a woman had discovered 2 envelopes left behind by her deceased father, a career criminal named Leroy Wetzel, with instructions stating they were to be opened only when he died. Curiosity got the better of her, and inside those envelopes was a handwritten, pitch-black confession that blew this entire cold case wide open, because Leroy Wetzel was a short, tattooed man with a ferocious temper nicknamed Short Circuit, and he happened to be the ex-husband of Patricia's younger sister, Sheila, according to Leroy's written words and subsequent jailhouse interviews. Patricia had called her sister Sheila back in 1990, complaining about Fred being a tightwad, and asked if she knew anyone who could eliminate him for a payment of $30,000, which Patricia promised to pay out from a $250,000 life insurance policy she expected to receive. Sheila turned to Leroy, who liked the idea of a $30,000 payday, and for an entire year, these 3 miserable individuals let that murderous plot marinate in their minds until April 24, 1990-1, when Patricia called to say the timing was perfect because she and her daughter would be away from house. Leroy drove up to High Point with a .22 caliber pistol, removed the ignition coil from his own car on Gallimore Dairy Road to simulate a breakdown, and telephoned Fred's house at 9:30 in the evening to beg for assistance. Fred, being the decent, helpful soul that he was, drove out to help his brother-in-law, and as they both stood looking under the hood of the car, Leroy walked to the back seat, pulled out the firearm, and told Fred that his own wife wanted him dead. Think about the absolute terror in Fred's heart in that final moment, realizing that his deepest fear had come true, that the woman he tried so hard to please had sent a monster to end his life. Fred begged for his life and turned to run, but Leroy shot him in the back, watched him drop face first into the dirt, and then stood over him to pump 2 more rounds into his skull. Leroy then fixed his car, drove away, and realized he forgot to make it look like a robbery. So he actually walked back to the bleeding corpse, stole Fred's wallet from his trousers, and later threw the firearm into the Coosa River before calling Patricia from a payphone in the middle of the night to confirm the deed was done. The beautiful irony of criminal stupidity is that Patricia never even paid Leroy his $30,000 because she claimed she did not have the cash, proving that there is absolutely no honor among thieves or murderers. And that grievance is exactly why Leroy wrote the letters that eventually destroyed them all. Investigators verified the story through old phone records showing late-night correspondence between the sisters in a traffic ticket that placed Leroy in the area at the exact time a neighbor reported hearing 3 distinct gunshots. By July 21, 1994, the authorities knocked on Patricia's door, and this arrogant woman simply said she knew they would be coming for her soon. When the first-degree murder trial commenced in May of 1995, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop as the 5'3" Leroy Wetzel stood before the jury with his long beard and tattooed arms, his hands visibly shaking as the judge made him reenact the execution using an office stapler. The defense tried to cook up a desperate story that Leroy and Sheila were actually trying to blackmail Fred by falsely accusing him of having an affair with a family friend, and that the shooting was just an accidental reaction, when Fred refused to pay hush money. But the jury saw right through that pathetic smokescreen. After 2 days of deliberation, the panel of 12 found Patricia Brown guilty of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to spend the rest of her natural life behind bars. Though her failing health ensured she only served less than 7 years before she died in prison in the year 2002 at the age of 53. Leroy and Sheila both pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received sentences of 50 years each, ensuring they would spend their best remaining years staring at stone walls. It is a terrible, senseless tragedy that 2 families were completely demolished and a good, honest man who loved his students and his children was wiped off the face of the earth, all because of real estate debt, a basic lack of human conscience, and a backyard full of exotic birds. Patricia Brown thought she could orchestrate the perfect escape from her financial misery, but in her greed to secure her own freedom, she ultimately clipped her own wings and ensured she would die in a cage, which is exactly where she belonged. Let's talk about a place called Wilton Manors, Florida, back in the late 1980s. It was a quiet bedroom community, low crime, the kind of place people moved to when they wanted to escape the noise of Fort Lauderdale and the relentless hustle of tourists. But on March 24th, 1987, at 9:22 p.m., that quiet was shattered by an urgent 911 call. A 37-year-old man named Bernie James was found inside his vehicle outside the family home. His wife claimed she found him there, with the front passenger seat fully reclined, slumped over and unresponsive. The family pulled him out and started cardiopulmonary resuscitation on the lawn, but by the time emergency medical services and the Wilton Manors Police Department arrived, he was already gone. Now, when you look at a body, it tells a story. Bernie James did not die of natural causes. The first responding officer noticed blood on the right side of his ear and inside the car center console. There was clear, blunt trauma to the right side of his head, right over the ear, but that was not all. He had ligature marks around his neck, ascending upward. That means someone pulled up on a rope or a wire and strangled him. This was done to him, and it was done effectively. He never stood a chance. When the detectives arrived, they found 3 family members outside: the brother-in-law, Michael, the mother-in-law, Jane, and the 36-year-old wife, Patty James. They all seemed shocked. Bernie James was the kind of man everybody loved. He was born on July 1st, 1949, in Washington, D.C., the eldest of 9 children. He loved nature, camping, and hiking. He served 2 tours in Vietnam as a lance corporal in the Marine Corps. That war had a profound impact on him, leaving deep mental scars, but also gave him protective nature. He returned home, became a firefighter and a paramedic, and met his first wife, Lisa. They had 3 children in just over 3 years, Michael, Irene, and Nicholas. But tragedy struck just before Christmas in 1980. Lisa suffered an aneurysm and died. Bernie was left completely distraught. A single father struggling to raise 3 toddlers, all close in age. I tell you, I can imagine how difficult that must have been. In 1982, yearning for love and a mother for his kids, Bernie was working dispatch at the fire station when a woman named Patty called the emergency line by mistake. They struck up a friendship over phone. She listened to his problems. She seemed nice. Patty came from a stable background in Silver Spring, Maryland. Her father was a police detective, her mother a banker, but Patty carried a deep insecurity. As a child, she had a tumor surgically removed from her face, leaving a very noticeable, deep scar that dragged a portion of her face down. It was the focus of her life. She thought she was hideous, deformed, and unlovable. She had already been through 2 failed marriages. When she was apprehensive about meeting Bernie in person, he did not see that physical scar. He saw a beautiful person on the inside. He possessed that rare, genuine kindness. Patty moved in, took steps to legally adopt the 3 toddlers, and became their new mother. Bernie felt a great weight lifted off his shoulders. Around 1983, they moved down to Florida to be near her family, and Bernie landed a job as a Florida State Park Ranger. Everything seemed perfect. But 3 years later, it all went horribly wrong. Back at the crime scene, detectives noticed things that did not add up. There were motor oil cans and tools inside the car. Bernie's wallet was found a few feet away on the driveway, rifled through, with no cash but his identification and credit cards intact. Now, in my experience, if a real robber takes a wallet, they do not inventory it on the driveway. They run down the street or hop in a getaway car, and you find the remnants blocks away. This was an inconsistency. This looked staged. Patty told detectives that they had just returned from a grocery store, and Bernie stayed outside to change the oil and fix an electrical problem. She claimed she went out later to check on him and saw him talking to a black male, approximately 6 feet tall, in his 20s, wearing a light shirt and dark pants, speaking with a French accent, and asking for matches to light a cigar. She claimed Bernie told her go inside, and 20 minutes later, she returned to find Bernie dead and the man gone. She then called her mother, and then her brother, who lived down the street, before calling emergency services. I tell you, calling your brother before paramedics when your husband is dying is out of the ordinary, but panic does strange things to people. The police sketched a mysterious French-accented man and knocked on doors, but nobody in that quiet neighborhood had seen anyone fitting that description. Then came the autopsy report. The blunt force trauma to Bernie's head would have caused a tremendous amount of bleeding. Yet, the passenger side of the vehicle did not have the volume of blood to match that injury. There were no defensive wounds on Bernie's body. He was completely surprised, hit from behind, and choked out. The medical examiner concluded this could not have happened inside that vehicle. There was simply no room to swing a weapon with that kind of force. Detectives inspected the car at a garage facility. They checked the oil dipstick. The engine was completely full of oil. It did not need an oil change. The scene was entirely manufactured. Someone was lying. On March 27, 1987, detectives interviewed Bernie's parents, who flew in for the funeral. They painted a disturbing picture. After marrying Patty, a rift had formed. Patty had demanded to be the sole focus, isolating Bernie from his family. He stopped helping his parents, and she convinced him to move to Florida to cut ties. The parents saw no affection between them, only a cold companionship. They revealed that Bernie's mother had received a phone call from him in the fall of 1985. He said he had had enough, that he was going to leave Patty and divorce her. Then, 6 months before the murder, the mother received a bizarre, typewritten letter supposedly from Bernie, claiming he had been drinking and abusing Patty. It was completely out of character for Bernie. The family suspected Patty wrote it to create a paper trail. On April 8, 1987, investigators brought Patty to the station under the guise of looking at mugshots, then pivoted to the inconsistencies. When confronted, her demeanor shifted. She lowered her head and said she knew who killed her husband. You have to be kidding me. She claimed she met a man named Tim at a bowling league, and Tim had witnessed Bernie being abusive toward her. She claimed that on the night of the murder, they went to Tim's apartment to discuss a bowling schedule. She went to use the bathroom, heard the television volume turn up high, and found herself locked inside. When Tim finally let her out, Bernie was gone from the living room. Tim allegedly grabbed her arm, took her outside, and showed her Bernie dead in the car. She claimed Tim drove her home, then walked back to fetch Bernie's car, parked in her driveway, and fled. She claimed she stayed quiet because she was terrified of Tim Ott, so she fabricated the robbery and the French-accented man. Detectives let her go for the moment and immediately brought Tim Ott in for questioning. Tim was soft-spoken and highly intelligent. When asked about Patty and Bernie James, he looked genuinely confused. He said he had never heard of them. Then detectives showed him a picture of Patty. Tim looked at it and said, "That is Demi. I know her as Demi." He explained that Demi was a friend of his fiancée, a woman named TJ, whom he had only ever met over the phone. Tim said TJ told him that her husband, Booth, was a severe abuser and a child molester. According to Tim, on the night of March 24th, Demi brought Booth to his apartment. Believing he was protecting children from a monster, Tim grabbed a baseball bat and struck Booth on the side of the head. When the man did not go down, Tim grabbed wire and strangled him, readjusting his grip several times until man had no breath left. They then loaded the body into the car and drove it back to the house. Detectives were stunned. They asked Tim for a photograph of his fiancée, TJ, and he pulled one from his wallet. It was a face investigators had never seen. Since Tim had never met TJ in person, the truth became sickeningly clear. Patty James was a master of deception. She was playing two different roles. She created TJ, a fictitious flight attendant, to manipulate Tim over the phone. When it was time to meet in person, she created Demi. Patty had used Tim out as a human weapon to execute her husband. Tim revealed that Patty had suggested other plots. They tried grinding up Valium and baking into a cake, but only made Bernie sick. They thought about shooting him in a remote field, but could not find the right location. Ultimately, they settled on Tim's bedroom. On April 8th, 15 days after the murder, Tim led detectives to his apartment. He had tried to clean the carpet, but when investigators sprayed luminol, the room lit up. There was a massive amount of blood, perfectly matching the blunt force trauma. Tim was formally charged with first-degree murder. As detectives dug into Patty's background, they uncovered a sociopathic con artist. Her primary income came from frivolous lawsuits. She spent years scamming everyone around her, using her own children as pawns. She forced her youngest son, Nicholas, to study American Sign Language books from the library and pretend to be deaf so she could scam churches out of money. She kept the children entirely isolated. Neighbors never even knew children lived in that house. They were never allowed to play on the street or leave the backyard. She completely severed their contact with Bernie's family. The children trusted her implicitly because they knew no better, enduring years of psychological abuse. The motive was layered in cold greed and fragile ego. Bernie was preparing to divorce her. Patty could not tolerate rejection. It would have been her third failed marriage. Furthermore, detectives discovered that before Bernie died, Patty had coerced him into taking out a substantial life insurance policy. She explicitly had all three of his children declared non-beneficiaries. Patty was the sole person set to collect. On June 8, 1987, investigators moved in and arrested Patty James at her children's school right after she dropped them off. In custody, she tried one final, desperate manipulation. She dropped her head, stayed quiet, and then popped back up, claiming she remembered absolutely nothing about the murder. She suggested that TJ must be another personality living inside her. It was a pathetic performance. Investigators were not buying it. Rather than risk a trial, Tim pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and agreed to testify against her. Patty's first trial in November 1987 ended in a mistrial because a single juror refused to deliberate or participate. But in her second trial, justice was not denied. Patty James was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. If the word evil can be applied to a human being, it belongs to Patty James. She possessed no conscience, no compassion, and no remorse. She viewed people as tools to be used and discarded. Her own stepchildren call her an evil stepmonster, a creature completely devoid of humanity. Bernie James survived 2 tours in the jungles of Vietnam and dedicated his life to saving others as a firefighter and protecting nature as a ranger, only to be slaughtered in a dingy apartment because of a wicked woman's greed. It is a tragedy that leaves a scar far deeper than any physical deformity ever could. I tell you, the world is a safer place with Patty James behind bars. Human beings are strange creatures. They destroy one another for the most ridiculous reasons you could ever imagine. Sometimes it is for a handful of crumpled dollar bills. Sometimes it is for a twisted version of love. And sometimes it is simply because they lack a soul. My. I tell you, after decades of looking into the eyes of monsters, nothing surprises me anymore but the sheer coldness of the human heart, can still make a man pause. This story takes us to Stanton, Missouri, a small, quiet community nestled in the rolling farmland between the Lake of the Ozarks and St. Louis, along Interstate 44. Franklin County is a largely rural place, a landscape dominated by endless farmland, deep woods, and silent fields. It is the kind of place where people mind their own business and assume their neighbors do the same. Buton tenayop October 22nd, 1992. Just after 9 o'clock, that quiet rural peace was shattered by a pillar of fire. A motorist traveling along the North Service Road noticed a bright orange glow in the distance, cutting through the autumn darkness. This gentleman decided to take a closer look. He walked up into the woods, pushed through a small patch of trees, and stepped out into an open field. What he found was a vehicle fully engulfed in flames. In those days, before everyone carried a telephone in their pocket, he had to walk back to find a landline to alert the authorities. Firefighters arrived within minutes, their hoses cutting through the dark as they doused the roaring flames. As the smoke began to clear, they made a gruesome discovery in the front passenger seat of the destroyed truck. There was a body inside, or what was left of one. The fire had been intense, a raging furnace that consumed almost everything, leaving behind only skeletal remains and dental fragments. The firefighters immediately contacted the Franklin County Sheriff Department. I received a call at 9:40 that night and instantly gathered my detectives to head out to that lonely field. When you stand in front of a burned-out vehicle in the middle of nowhere, the questions start piling up fast. Why is this truck here? Where did it come from? And most importantly, who is the victim? You have to start from the inside of the wreckage and slowly work your way out. Finding answers would not be easy because the fire had destroyed almost all the physical evidence, leaving nothing on the outside but a scorched metal frame. There was no wallet, no driver license, no piece of paper to give this poor soul a name. However, as detectives carefully sifted through the ashes in the front passenger seat, they discovered a few items that the fire could not completely erase. There was a gold chain, a ring, a watch, and a metal belt buckle featuring the emblem of Ducks Unlimited, a well-known hunting group. As they examined the skeletal remains further, they spotted a crucial anatomical clue. There was a distinct metal rod embedded in the right leg, the unmistakable mark of a past surgical repair from a severe injury. Searching around the exterior of the frame, investigators noticed something highly suspicious. The license plates had been deliberately removed. Whoever did this was trying to delay law enforcement, trying to buy time by making it as difficult as possible to identify the vehicle and find out where the owner lived. But the killers made a classic mistake, the kind of blunder that born losers always make. They forgot about the vehicle identification number etched deep into the metal frame. When dispatch ran that number, it came back to Danny and Karen Coleman at an address in St. Louis, roughly a 45-minute drive from that lonely field. Investigators wasted no time and headed straight to the residence, arriving at about 2:30 in the morning. They found Karen Coleman and her 18-year-old son, Joby, inside the house. Danny was nowhere to be seen. Karen expressed immediate concern, telling the detectives that her husband was a responsible man who always called if he was going to be late, but she had heard nothing from him that evening. The detectives, maintaining their professional distance, began to present the charred items recovered from the scene. They showed her descriptions of the jewelry, the watch, the ring, the gold necklace, and the hunting belt buckle. The family confirmed those items belonged to Danny. Then came the final piece of the puzzle. The detectives mentioned the metal pin in the right leg of the body. Joby looked at them and confirmed his father had been in a severe motorcycle accident years ago and carried a rod in that exact leg. At that moment, the room filled with tears. The family wanted answers, and they wanted justice. Danny Coleman was a 38-year-old mechanical engineer at a company called Multiplex, where he worked on manufacturing soda machines for large fast food chains like McDonald's. He was a straight arrow, an Army veteran who had been stationed in Germany back in MOT Non-Chin Tram Bay Moy MOT until a motorcycle accident cut his military career short and left him with that metal rod in his leg. He walked with noticeable limp, but he never let it slow him down. He met Karen while recovering at the military hospital in Fort Leonard, Missouri, introduced by a cousin. They bonded over a shared love for the outdoors, hunting and fishing. Thầy Madit in 1973, and 9 years later, thầy Sonzo was born. Danny was a blue-collar provider who strived to ensure his family wanted for nothing. He was widely respected, easygoing, and devoted his free time to teaching children firearms safety as a hunter safety instructor. In 1980, he even started a successful side business treating ceramic flooring to make it non-slip. By all appearances, he was a good man living the American dream. When detectives began questioning Karen about potential enemies or any connection to the Stanton area, she painted a picture of a blissful 19-year marriage. She claimed they were a loving couple who got along perfectly. To the investigators, the family dynamic seemed solid, and no immediate red flags pointed toward anyone inside the home. On October 23, 1992, St. Louis made a seminar. Dr. Mary Case utilized dental records to officially confirm the identity of the remains. But the autopsy revealed something far more sinister than a simple fire. There was tremendous blunt force trauma to the victim's skull. Someone had beaten Danny Coleman to death with a heavy instrument, something akin to a baseball bat, before setting the truck ablaze. This was now a definitive homicide investigation. The next morning, investigators returned to the field in Stanton, searching the area with a fine tooth comb under the morning light. Near the site of the fire, they discovered a few discarded matches and a matchbook case with cellophane wrapper. This wrapper had survived the elements, and the crime lab managed to develop a single, clean latent fingerprint from it. They ran it through the statewide database, but MOT non-Chin Tram Chin Muay Hai. The system yielded no matches. That fingerprint was secured in an evidence locker, waiting for the world to catch up. As detectives interviewed Danny co-workers, they discovered that on the day before his body was found, Danny received a cryptic telephone call at work and left unexpectedly early. No one heard the entire conversation, but someone caught the name Rich. Phone records revealed frequent communication between Danny and his close friend and business associate, Rich Saluka. What truly caught the attention of investigators, however, were two phone calls made from the Coleman home to Rich House at 1:30 and 3:30 in the morning on the night of the murder. Rich was brought in for questioning as a person of interest. He was entirely cooperative, explaining that he and Danny were tight friends who worked on flooring projects together. When pressed about the late-night calls, Rich explained that Karen had called in a panic, looking for her husband. During the second call at 3:30, after detectives had left her house, Karen delivered the devastating news, stating they found him. He is dead in his burning truck. Rich was visibly distraught and in shock. His alibi checked out completely, and his sincere demeanor convinced the major case squad that he had no part in this horror. He was eliminated as a suspect. But when asked about the Coleman marriage, Rich dropped a hint that changed everything. He noted that while Danny never spoke negatively about his wife, he had admitted a few months prior that they were facing serious issues. Rich described Karen as a much rougher person compared to the gentle Danny. Armed with this insight, detectives began digging deeper into Karen's life, interviewing acquaintances, and scratching beneath the surface of her suburban housewife persona. What they found was a staggering double life. Karen Coleman was not the grieving, innocent widow she pretended to be. She was deeply involved in an active addiction to cocaine and methamphetamines, and she had been dealing methamphetamine for a number of years. Furthermore, she had engaged in multiple extramarital affairs. If Danny, with his straight-laced morals, had discovered the full extent of this betrayal, he would have divorced her in a heartbeat. Karen was terrified of losing financial security, and she despised her husband for standing in the way of her lifestyle. Yet, despite their suspicions, investigators could not find a direct physical link tying Karen or her paramours to the murder scene. The case slowly grew cold, settling for 1992 on the way to 1998. The file sat on a shelf, but justice has a way of waiting. In 1999, the Federal Bureau of Investigation Field Office in St. Louis received a remarkable telephone call from Missouri State Penitentiary. An inmate reported a conversation that had taken place behind prison walls regarding an unsolved murder in a rural Missouri field. The source of this information was a convicted armed robber named Larry Nolan. Before he passed away, Larry made a detailed deathbed confession to his cellmate about a homicide he had personally orchestrated. It was the murder of Danny Coleman. FBI agents and local detectives immediately converged on the prison to interview the informant. The story that emerged was a twisted narrative of greed, lust, and utter betrayal. Karen Coleman was close friends with Michelle Nolan, who happened to be Larry Nolan's wife. Karen started visiting Larry completely on her own. She seduced her best friend husband, using him for her own dark purposes. Larry fell desperately in love with Karen, and once she had him wrapped around her finger, she asked him for a terrifying favor. She wanted her husband dead. Danny carried a $50,000 life insurance policy. Karen promised Larry that if he arranged the hit, she would pay him $15,000 from the insurance proceeds and marry him once he was released. Sitting in his cell in Jefferson City, Larry hatched the plot. He reached out to a longtime friend outside the walls named James Cornhart. Cornhart was a local firefighter in the St. Louis area, a position that commands public trust. But Larry knew that for the right price, this firefighter would become an executioner. Karen provided detailed schedules of Danny day-to-day activities, which Larry passed along to Cornhart. The informant also revealed a detail that contradicted the original blunt force trauma finding. He claimed Danny had actually been shot with a pistol fitted with a custom-made silencer that Larry had helped arrange. According to the inmate, after the murder was carried out, she dropped him like a bad habit, without ever paying him a single dollar of the blood money. Larry died furious, realizing he had been double-crossed by the woman he loved. He confessed to clean his conscience and to burn the woman who burned him. Investigators immediately went to work verifying this wild tale. They checked prison logs, and sure enough, both Karen Coleman and James Cornhart were on Larry Nolan official visitor lists. Next, they asked Dr. Mary Case to reevaluate Danny's skull fragments. In the field of forensics, there is a term known as a lead snowstorm. When a bullet strikes bone at high velocity, it can disintegrate, leaving a spray of tiny metallic fragments that show up on an X-ray like a storm of white snow. Because of the extreme fire and structural damage to the skull, these tiny fragments had been missed during the initial autopsy. When the medical examiner re-examined the X-rays with the specific information in mind, she found the lead snowstorm. Danny Coleman had indeed been shot in the head. On July 12, 1999, investigators attempted to interview James Cornhart, but he refused to cooperate, exercising his constitutional right. They confronted Karen Coleman as well, but she denied any involvement, blaming her past erratic behavior entirely on her drug addiction, while swearing she had no part in her husband's death. The case stalled yet again because prosecutors lacked the ironclad proof needed to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. They knew Karen had received a $50,000 insurance payout, and financial records showed suspicious cash withdrawals, but it was not enough. Years passed, but the detectives refused to let Danny's memory fade. In 2008, investigators presented the file to the United States Attorney Office in St. Louis. Federal prosecutors saw the strength of the conspiracy case and decided to take it over, bringing the immense resources of the federal government to bear. On December 3, 2008, federal authorities moved swiftly to a St. Louis firehouse where James Cornhart was on duty and placed a 49-year-old under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder for hire. He was taken to the FBI office for processing, where his fingerprints were taken. Forensic examiners compared his prints to that loan. Latent fingerprint recovered from the cellophane matchbook wrapper 16 years earlier. It was a perfect scientific match. James Cornhart had dropped that matchbook in that lonely field. Investigators then located and arrested the 54-year-old widow, Karen Coleman, while the defendants awaited trial. Prosecutors began reviewing the recorded telephone calls James made from the St. Louis County Justice Center in Clayton. Inmates are well aware that their calls are recorded, but desperation makes people stupid. James called a friend named Steve Mueller, instructing him in coded language to go to his house and destroy a hidden firearm, ammunition, and a silencer constructed out of a lawnmower muffler located in the garage. Investigators tracked down Steve Mueller immediately. When confronted with the recordings, Mueller broke down, weeping as he unburdened his conscience. He confessed that he had taken a weapon and the makeshift muffler and thrown them off the Jefferson Barracks Bridge into the waters of South St. Louis County. But Mueller's confession went much deeper. He revealed that he was not just an accessory after the fact. He was a full participant in the execution. Larry Nolan had contacted Cornhart, and Cornhart had recruited Mueller along with a mysterious third individual known only by the street name Dozer. On 10 October 22nd, 1992, these three men lured Danny Coleman to a vacant house under the false pretense of providing evidence regarding his wife's infidelity. The moment the unsuspecting Danny walked through the door, he was totally blindsided. They brutally attacked him, beating him severely. But Steve Mueller admitted to investigators that he was the one who pulled the trigger, firing 3 shots to end Danny's life. The 3 conspirators then placed Danny's body into the front passenger seat of his own truck. One of them drove the victim truck, while the others followed in a getaway car, traveling down Interstate 44 until they reached the remote field in Stanton. There, they set the vehicle on fire, hoping the flames would wash away their sins. Karen Coleman realized she was facing a lifetime behind federal bars. She decided to save herself and cut a deal with the prosecution, pleading guilty to conspiracy and murder for hire. She sat down with authorities and laid bare her hollow soul. She confessed that she wanted out of the marriage and used Larry Nolan's romantic obsession to orchestrate the hit. She confirmed the exact financial promises made to killers: $2,000 for Larry, $17,000 for James Cornhart, and $1,200 for Steve Mueller. It was an incredibly cold, calculated plot. These hitmen had no personal grievance against Danny Coleman. They slaughtered a good man simply for the promise of a few pieces of silver. Karen agreed to testify against her co-conspirators, but she requested that her son, Joby, not be present in the courtroom during her testimony. Joby, seeking justice for the father he loved, agreed to step out, spared from hearing the horrific details from his own mother's lips. The pieces of the puzzle fell perfectly into place. Karen's testimony, the undeniable match of the 16-year-old fingerprint on the cellophane wrapper, the recorded prison phone calls, and Steve Mueller's confession created an airtight case. The jury found James Cornhart and Steve Mueller guilty on all counts. Both men were sentenced to spend the remainder of their natural lives in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. It was a satisfactory conclusion for the investigative team and provided a semblance of closure for Joby. Karen Coleman was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison in exchange for her cooperation. Personally, I found that sentence deeply disappointing. She was the instigator, the serpent who set the entire tragedy into motion, and she deserved to grow old and die in a cell just like the rest of them. To this day, the identity of the third hitman, Dozer, remains a mystery, and the case technically stays open as authorities look for that final piece of garbage. Danny Coleman was an asset to this world, a kind father, a dedicated worker, and a veteran. He was completely blindsided by the woman who swore to love and protect him, a betrayal that led to his cruel death. The killers thought they could hide their monstrous deed in a remote field under a blanket of fire, but they forgot one simple truth. Lies can smoke for a long time, but the truth eventually cuts through the ash like a brilliant light. You can run and you can hide, but justice will always find a way to knock on your door. I tell you, human beings are strange creatures. They kill for the most foolish reasons you can possibly imagine. They kill for money. They kill for pride. But worst of all, they kill for an illusion created inside their own minds. My. You look at a quiet, family-based community in Rowan County, North Carolina, a place nestled between Charlotte and Greensboro where the city of Kannapolis is renowned for its textiles. It is an upper-middle-class neighborhood with homes within eyeshot of each other, the kind of place where people move to raise their children and sleep soundly at night. It is not the kind of neighborhood where you expect to find violent crime. But evil does not care about your zip code, and it does not check your income status before it knocks on the front door. On July 23rd, 2013, at 9 hours and 40 minutes in the morning, a 911 call upends at calm Tuesday morning. The caller is 59-year-old Chuck Reeves, and he is in dire need of help for his fiancée, 62-year-old Shirley Pierce. When the first responders arrive on the scene, they walk into a nice, quiet house, but there's an eerie feeling in the air, and then comes the smell. It is the sharp, chemical odor of sodium hypochlorite, commonly known as household bleach. In the main bedroom, detectives see bloodstains on the carpet, a trail of red that continues across the floor, and leads straight into the master bathroom. Inside that bathroom, they find a ferocious scene. The body of Shirley Pierce is lying motionless in the bathtub, with the water still running over her cold form. She has suffered multiple sharp force injuries to her face and her neck. This is not an accidental death, and it is not a robbery gone wrong. This is a targeted, deeply personal execution driven by an intense amount of rage. Now, when you have a homicide inside a residence with no signs of forced entry, you always look at the person who found the body. That is police work 101. Detectives turn their focus to Chuck Reeves. He is devastated, torn up, but completely cooperative. He explains that he spoke to Shirley the night before around 8 hours and 15 minutes in the evening. She was supposed to watch his dog while he traveled out of town for business. In the middle of the conversation, the phone suddenly went dead. Drop calls are common in that part of Kannapolis due to spotty cellular service, so he did not panic. But when he arrived the next morning, the garage door was open, the house door was locked, and he had to use a spare key hidden in a flower bed to get inside. He heard the shower running, walked in, and found his worst nightmare. Investigators analyzed every single word, looking for inconsistencies. But Chuck has a rock-solid alibi confirmed by his employer in South Carolina. Furthermore, his hands are completely clean. When an individual uses a sharp weapon to assault another human being, the weapon becomes slippery with blood, and the assailant almost always cuts their own hands. Chuck does not have a single scratch on him. He is cleared as a suspect. So, who wanted this beautiful, outgoing Southern lady dead? Everyone loved Shirley. She was a professional administrative assistant to the chief executive officer at Tuscarora Yarns, a dedicated mother to her daughter Tracy, and a doting grandmother. She spent her free time organizing charity galas for people with traumatic brain injuries. She had a massive heart, but when detectives interviewed Tracy, a ghost from the past emerges. 10 years prior, Shirley was in an abusive relationship with a man named Richard, which resulted in a restraining order after he threatened her life with a tool. Richard had recently re-entered the area and tried to make contact. He becomes a prime suspect. Detectives track him down to a local pawn shop just 15 minutes away. Richard is shocked by the news. His hands are clear of injuries, and he suffers from severe health problems that render him physically incapable of committing a violent assault. He can barely walk. Another dead end. But then, the telephone rings at the sheriff's department. It is a call that changes everything. Irvin Johnson, the chief financial officer of Tuscarora Yarns, contact authorities because he believes his own wife, 61-year-old Marlene Johnson, has murdered Shirley Pierce. I tell you, it is quite a shocker when a spouse calls in to report their own partner for homicide. That is something you do not hear every day. Irvin sits down with investigators and begins to paint a psychological portrait of a dark, unhinged mind driven by absolute ego and toxic jealousy. Marlene grew up in a wealthy family in Gastonia, North Carolina. She was a woman who was used to getting her way, a refined individual who dressed the nines and spoke eloquently. But beneath that polished exterior lay a possessive monster. In 2003, Marlene suffered severe nervous breakdown and attempted suicide. Irvin states she never fully recovered. She became highly aggressive, erratic, and utterly convinced that her husband was engaging in infidelities with single women at his workplace. When Irvin started his position at Tuscarora Yarns in 2006 and introduced Marlene to Shirley, Shirley politely called him honey and touched his arm, a standard piece of Southern hospitality. In that exact moment, Marlene's internal antenna went up. In her twisted mind, the delusion was born. For 7 years, Marlene made it her daily mission to destroy Shirley Pierce. She became completely fixated, hiring private investigators to conduct surveillance. When the first investigator found absolutely no proof of wrongdoing, Marlene grew frustrated and hired a second firm that utilized aerial drones to capture images of Shirley's home. She memorized Shirley's schedule, knew when she went to the grocery store, and monitored how far her garage door was open. There was no convincing her otherwise. Her mind demanded the affair be real to feed her own deep-seated insecurity. Shirley, knowing she was innocent, refused to live in fear and assumed the madness would pass. She was wrong. In 2011, the paranoia exploded into physical violence. Marlene tracked Shirley to a local restaurant where she was having lunch with co-workers. Marlene hid her face behind a menu, waited, and then launched a vicious ambush in the parking lot, grabbing Shirley by the hair and screaming death threats. Marlene was arrested for assault, but Shirley, showing her characteristic kindness, refused to press charges to avoid causing professional difficulty for Irvin. Irvin eventually moved out and obtained his own restraining order, but the damage was done. Detectives secure a search warrant for Marlene's vehicle and residence. Inside her trunk, they find an array of chemical cleaning supplies. Inside her dining room, they discover Google Maps aerial photographs of Shirley's house and hours of surveillance notes. It is a roadmap of obsession. When Marlene is brought in for questioning, she sits with her sunglasses on, acting bored, detached, and completely arrogant. She refuses to answer questions, but her physical body betrays her. Investigators examine her hands and notice she has a French manicure, but the tips of her fingernails are missing and her fingers are covered in fresh cuts, perfectly consistent with a hand slipping during a frenzied knife attack. The next day, the medical examiner delivers a critical piece of evidence. During the post-mortem examination, they discover a broken knife blade lodged deep inside the victim's neck. The force required to break a stainless steel kitchen blade inside a human body is immense. Armed with this knowledge, detectives execute a search warrant at the home of Tim Connor, a motivational speaker and author who served as Marlene's close confidant. They find a kitchen knife block where 3 knives are present, and the fourth, a matching blade, is missing. The recovered blade matches Tim's set perfectly. When confronted, Tim breaks down, turns from cool to groveling, and admits he lied to provide Marlene with a false alibi for the night of the murder. He reveals that Marlene approached him the morning after the crime, begging him to tell police she had been with him all night. Her alibi vanishes into thin air. The final nail in the coffin arrives from the State Crime Laboratory. Forensic technicians locate Marlene Johnson's deoxyribonucleic acid on the shower curtain where Shirley's body was deposited. The sequence of events is clear. On July 22, 2013, Shirley drove into her garage, walked into her home, and began preparing for bed. Marlene, utilizing her years of stalker knowledge, slipped through the open garage door behind her She launched a brutal, unprovoked assault, inflicting excruciating pain upon an innocent woman who did nothing but exist. Marlene then dragged the body to the tub, turned on the water, and attempted to eliminate her own biological evidence using bleach, unaware that science would ultimately catch up to her. In January of 2018, Marlene Johnson stands trial for first-degree murder. She arrives dressed professionally, maintaining an aura of untouchable innocence. But you cannot argue with science, and you cannot argue with the cuts on your own fingers. On January 24th, 2018, the jury returns a swift verdict of guilty. The moment the clerk reads the word, Marlene lets out an audible gasp and collapses onto the courtroom floor. The judge prevents anyone from removing her until the formal sentence is handed down. She is sentenced to spend the remainder of her natural life behind bars with no possibility of parole. A wicked, cowardly individual removed from civil society, leaving a family, a daughter, and a fiancé to mourn a beautiful soul who was taken for absolutely no reason at all. Case 2, the breaking point. Sometimes circumstances create a devil. You can take a good, decent, hard-working human being, subject them to decades of unrelenting pressure, and watch as they reach a breaking point that leads straight to cold-blooded murder. You have to be kidding me. You look at St. Petersburg, Florida, a beautiful coastal city that attracts retirees and families from all across the United States. It is a sleepy town that has experienced a residential boom, filled with quiet neighborhoods and mobile home communities. On May 9, 2005, at 10 hours and 30 minutes in the morning, an independent contractor named Jason McCain and his son arrive at a mobile home on Yellow Pine Drive. The residence has fallen into foreclosure, and a finance company has hired a clean-out crew to clear the interior. Neighbors indicate that no one has been seen at the property for 8 or 9 months. When the cleaning crew steps inside, they are hit with a foul, heavy odor. They assume it is merely spoiled food left behind in an abandoned refrigerator. The trailer is a time capsule of a sudden departure. A half-undecorated Christmas tree stands in the hallway. Calendars are frozen in time, and Star Wars memorabilia is scattered about. But as they clear 75% of the home, the stench becomes unbearable near a closed bedroom door. They enter the room and find a mattress with several heavy blankets piled on top. When they attempt to lift the linens, they find them extraordinarily heavy, sticking to the mattress like Velcro pulling apart. They drag the bundle to the floor, the plastic tearing open upon impact, revealing a mummified human leg and foot. A terrified 911 call brings the St. Petersburg police to the scene. Due to extreme decomposition, the gender and race of the decedent are impossible to determine visually. It is clear the body has been rotting under those sheets for several months. Property records show the trailer belongs to 2 sisters, Barbara Burns and Deborah Burns. Both are completely missing. To understand how a human corpse ends up hidden on a bedroom floor for nearly a year, you have to look into the history of the family. Barbara Burns was born in 1951 in Maryland to a blue-collar family. She was a likable, jolly girl who loved the summer trips to Virginia Beach. But in 1964, her youngest sister, Debbie, was born. At 2 years of age, Debbie contracted scarlet fever, resulting in severe neurological and brain damage. She was left permanently learning disabled, possessing the mental capacity of a 6-year-old child. Shortly thereafter, their father passed away. At the tender age of 15, Barbara's life effectively ended. She was pulled out of high school to become a full-time nursemaid and caretaker for her disabled sister. For the next 4 decades, Barbara bore an unimaginable burden. The family moved to Florida in 1981. Barbara worked grueling, long hours at minimum-wage restaurant jobs and retail positions at Beal's outlet to act as the sole breadwinner, only to return home each night to care for Debbie and their mother, who was battling advanced Alzheimer's disease. Her personal life was non-existent. She had no friends, no social outings, and no escape. Following her mother's passing in 2000, tragedy struck again when their brother John died. However, John left his sisters an inheritance of $350,000 to ensure Debbie would be taken care of. For the first time in 40 years, Barbara believed she could breathe. She quit her retail job, and the sisters began living a fantasy life, taking lavish vacations to California and Australia, and purchasing the mobile home on Yellow Pine Drive. But money does not solve a psychological disability. Debbie possessed no impulse control. Because the money was left in her name, she became the absolute boss of finances, demanding her own credit cards and embarking on massive online shopping sprees, filling the trailer with hundreds of expensive toys and trinkets. Worse still, Debbie fell victim to an online romance scam, mailing thousands of dollars to a man in Miami who vanished the moment the funds dried up within a brief span of 3 years. The entire $350,000 was completely gone. By 2004, the sisters were broke, and the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. The dynamic between the two women turned incredibly toxic. Debbie could not comprehend that the wealth was gone. She remained highly demanding, verbally abusive, disrespectful, and physically aggressive toward Barbara. During a past workplace holiday party, when Barbara wished to remain at the event, Debbie threw a violent tantrum, striking her older sister and knocking her down, forcing Barbara to leave. Barbara was trapped in a codependent nightmare with a perpetual child who grew more tyrannical by the day. Detectives auditing the financial records discover that while Debbie is missing, her monthly Social Security disability check of $651 is still being actively withdrawn via automated teller machines in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Surveillance footage identifies the individual executing the withdrawals as Barbara Burns. She is alive, well, and working at a 7-Eleven convenience store in Virginia. Investigators fly to Virginia Beach, establish surveillance, and arrest Barbara at 7 hours in the morning as she finishes her shift. During the initial interrogation at the police department, Barbara attempts a clumsy dance of deception. She denies ever owning property on Yellow Pine Drive, claims she has no siblings, and states she does not know anyone named Deborah Burns. But detectives present her with a photograph of her sister. The wall of denial crumbles, an emotional dam breaks. She confesses to the homicide, weeping as she narrates the final hours of August 14th, 2004, which was Debbie's 40th birthday. They had gone to a restaurant where an argument erupted over their financial ruin. Upon returning home, the dispute escalated into a physical altercation. Debbie eventually went to bed in the single room they were forced to share, where their heads almost touched every night. Barbara sat in the living room, listening to her sister snore, gripped by an overwhelming sense of dread. She realized that the moment morning arrived, the screaming, the abuse, and the financial misery would simply start all over again. She had given 40 years of her existence to this person, and she had absolutely nothing left to give. She walked to a dresser, retrieved a .38 caliber handgun she had purchased for self-defense, walked to the bed, placed the barrel against her sister's forehead, and pulled the trigger a single time. What happens next is a testament to the bizarre nature of human psychology. Barbara did not flee immediately. She wrapped her sister's remains in towels, sheets, and plastic garbage bags. She then continued to reside inside that mobile home alongside her sister's decomposing body for a period of 6 weeks. She placed open boxes of baking soda, bowls of potpourri, and dozens of automotive cardboard air fresheners throughout the rooms to desperately mask the advancing odor of decay, living in total denial before finally leaving her van at a bus terminal and boarding a Greyhound bus to Virginia Beach, seeking the only place where she possessed happy childhood memories. Detectives return to the abandoned trailer and locate the .38 caliber revolver hidden in the exact dresser drawer Barbara described, with the single spent casing carefully placed back into the ammunition box. Faced with a sympathetic figure who had simply snapped under the weight of an abusive, lifetime caretaking dynamic, the state attorney's office offers a plea agreement. Barbara Burns pleads guilty to a reduced charge of manslaughter and is sentenced to 15 years in state prison. While in the correctional facility, Barbara manages exceptionally well. She is a model inmate, For the very first time in her entire life, someone else cooks her meals, someone else manages the schedule, and she is entirely liberated from the crushing responsibility that dictated her existence for 4 decades. She served 12 years of her sentence before being released for good behavior in 2018. She returned to St. Petersburg, carrying the immense grief and guilt of her actions, missing her sister's face every single day. I will remember this case for the rest of my days as the absolute epitome of a good person who did a very, very bad thing. Sometimes, my friends, the circumstances of life can push a human being past the brink of sanity, straight into the abyss.